The technology underlying podcasts is simple. A podcaster publishes MP3 files to an RSS feed, and the listener subscribes to that feed, receiving MP3s whenever the feed is updated. Unfortunately, the simplicity of podcasts makes it difficult to build automated advertising infrastructure on top of that simple RSS model. This lack of rich automated advertising has kept podcasting from flourishing. aCast is a company that is trying to change that by providing a better podcasting experience for both the publisher and the listener. Today's guest, Mikael Emtinger, is a creative technologist at aCast, and we discuss the infrastructure around podcasts and how aCast is trying to improve it. Before we get to this episode, a few quick announcements. Software Engineering Daily's community is building Software Daily. It's an open source news and information site about software. If you're a web developer, please check it out. It might be a project you want to work on. Also, you can go to softwareengineeringdaily.com where you can find links to the Slack channel for this podcast. You can find out how to become a host if you're interested in hosting episodes. And you can find my Twitter account, my email. I would love to get your feedback. Also, don't forget to sign up for the newsletter, Software Weekly, featuring curated content from the Software Engineering Daily team. And with that, let's get to this episode after a quick message from today's sponsor. I had a crazy idea a couple weeks ago. It's a photo sharing app that only has pictures of cats. When I finish my photo sharing cat application, I will be deploying it to Linode because Linode is the fastest hosted Linux provider. I don't want to get locked into a proprietary platform that's going to overcharge me as soon as my app gets popular. I just want a fast Linux server with simple pricing. Go to linode.com/sedaily and get $20 in free credit today. Plans start at $10 a month, so my free $20 will be plenty to launch my cat photo sharing app. Once I need to scale, I can use tools like node balancers and backups, and Linode has built-in dashboarding and metrics so that I can see the traffic to my Linode servers, and I can understand how many of my users are posting cat pictures and looking at each other's cat pictures. Go to linode.com/sedaily and get $20 in free credit today. The plans start at $10 a month, so it's a great deal. Thanks to Linode for sponsoring Software Engineering Daily. Now let's get on to this episode. Mikael Emtinger is a creative technologist at aCast. Mikael, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
I want to start by talking about podcasting infrastructure and the software, the infrastructure behind all of these podcasts that we're using. Can you give me a high-level overview of the podcasting infrastructure as it exists today?
Sure. So it's really simple. Actually, it's all based on RSS, and anyone with like an RSS link can pretty much broadcast a podcast. So you just put up your audio file somewhere, and you put up an RSS feed somewhere, and anyone with that link can pretty much listen to your podcast in any podcatcher app. So
RSS is just another way of viewing content on the web, just like HTML or some other markup format.
Yes, that's right. So I don't really know the origins of RSS, but I think it was pretty much invented for news feeds. Basically, I think that was the inventor's intention. So to be able to publish news snippets, basically, and in the context of podcast, it's an episode. So you publish episodes instead of news snippets, basically.
So you don't know the historical legacy of why it is this way, but what are the pros and cons of this infrastructure?
I think the pros is that it's really basic and accessible. It's a format that's been existing since way back, and So that's like the simplicity of it is really, really beautiful, and that's what makes podcasting great, I think. And it's also another thing is that anyone pretty much can publish themselves, so you don't have to go through, let's say, Spotify for music, or you don't have to go through Facebook to publish your news or something like that. Like, it's so simple that anyone can put it out there. So from a rights and legal perspective, it's also really nice, because most podcasters pretty much own all the rights to their content, basically, which I like. The downside, though, there are some downsides to it, and it can be difficult to find podcast because it's so spread out. It's not like, okay, I go to Netflix and I find everything there, or I go to Spotify and find everything there. It's like it's really a wild garden, and really no one yet has solved that problem to kind of make everything accessible to everybody.
Why is that indexing and discovery problem any more challenging than the web? I mean, the web is pretty arguably well indexed.
Yeah, I'd say that it's because it's audio and not text. Web is so text dominant, and Google pretty much solved indexing of the web and structuring the information on the web. But it's because it's so easy to index text, and when you do a search, you put in text, and they match that against their index text database. That will happen with audio as well, but it's still a problem what do you say? What do you call it?
Text to speech.
Text to speech
speech to text.
Yeah, it's speech to text, right? It's the technology for that is advancing dramatically fast, but it's still not perfect, and it takes a lot of compute power. And there are companies working with that, and we are working with them, and we're working internally as well with that.
The text stuff it seems like the technology is actually really well developed, but at the high end it's still cost prohibitive because or I don't know, maybe you could tell me, because I know for a long time it was sort of the model was basically you run a speech to text algorithm on the audio, and then you kick the text version to a Mechanical Turk, some person in Bosnia or the Philippines, and then they look over the text for problems, and then they are an extra layer of error checking. Is that still the way that this is done, or is there a completely automated solution?
The solutions that we're looking at is completely automated. But it's really good in English, and I don't know Chinese, but maybe it's really good in Chinese and Spanish, but the big languages. But small languages like Sweden, it's really, really not there yet. So there's still some way to go to before we actually solve that, but it's it's on the map, and it will be solved eventually, and I don't think any humans will be involved actually.
I totally believe that, but what's interesting about this is that the metadata alone is not good enough to do the indexing on this content. I mean, you would think podcasts tend to be about niche topics like news or sports or football specifically, or software engineering specifically, and there's all this long tailness to the content types. I find it surprising that it's hard to index using only metadata. It seems like you could use the metadata, which is in text format, and index podcasts that way. But it sounds like what you're saying is that you simply cannot do that. You need the text to speech or the speech to text to get even more data and really do some accurate indexing.
Yeah, and if you look, that's the truth, and it's also many content creators. Or podcast publishers maybe don't really think about that when they put their stuff out there. they're really good at doing their audio, but maybe they're not like tagging it enough, and but
I definitely don't do that.
You don't do that either.
And I'm an engineer. I mean, I tag it with stuff. Like, I will tag this episode with like some WordPress tags. Like, but I don't even know if the WordPress tags translate to the audio file tags, and if they get pulled into the different podcast aggregators.
No, but I mean, we at aCast, we pull out everything we can from the RSS feeds and index that. We can definitely be better at search, and we will be. But it's pretty limited amount of data to do like proper, really good indexing, I'd say. And as when we get to like the majority of the speech to text, there it will be dramatically different, I think, and much easier to find. It's also podcast. Many episodes are like hour long, and maybe you're interested in like 5 minutes of that, and it's really hard to find those 5 minutes, and I think when we get like speech to text, that will also improve, so you can like search for specific topics, and really you don't have to listen to the other 45 minutes, and just to the 5 minutes that you're interested in.
Oh, yeah. And it would be so great to have podcasts Twitterized and broken down into smaller, rather than it's sort of like blogging went from these long blog posts in the early days to 140 character blogging, so that you can read streams of the world blogging about different things in 140 character snippets. That's going to be a really awesome golden age when you can flip on a podcast about, say, software and get an endless stream of 10 or 15 minute snippets about software. That would just be fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that would be, increase like, what do you say, like conversion, like following conversion, because I think one of the greatest things with podcast is that it's like formatless. There's you can talk about a subject for 3 hours if you like. There is no like tabloid times to match, basically, like on TV or so. You can just dive into a subject for how long it needs to take, basically, which I love about podcasts. But discovery of that is just not there yet, I think.
Yeah, and no, it's interesting that despite the fact that there are no tabloids, no limitations, we tend towards this one-on-one interview format. That's almost become the norm. It must be like 95% of podcasts are like this, and the ones that experiment beyond that have something of an advantage. I mean, obviously, there's more editing required for exploratory formats. I kind of want to shift the conversation because there's a lot to talk about.
Sure.
I think that the podcast infrastructure today has kind of a chicken and egg problem with advertising also, because some of the problems that you're discussing are things that are definitely solvable, and they would get solved faster in industries where there was more money at stake. But what's interesting is that podcasting seems to be like, oh, if we solve this problem, there actually might be a huge influx of money. So you kind of have this chicken and egg problem. Who's going to solve these problems when there's not a direct incentive? Maybe you could just touch on how the current podcast infrastructure leads to challenges and limitation in advertising.
Right. So the current model is that most podcasters do this on their spare time. Then there is this segment where they have somebody who actually sell ads, and they have like self-read ads, which are great. And you make a little money. Some people can actually live on their podcast, but to make to transition into like a mass medium, you need to have like a platform and that actually solves this for you, and that's what we're trying to do at aCast. So one of our customers is obviously podcasters who want to live on their podcasts and reach bigger audience, basically, and get into that good spiral, basically. So that's what we're trying to do is, you come to us, it's free, and we sell ads for you. Basically, we do the heavy lifting there. So you focus on your content, and hopefully that focus leads to like better content, and we can sell more. You get more listeners, basically. And that's how we see, how we spiral podcast into a mass medium from this, like, what do you say, nerd medium that it's been for ages, basically. Did that answer your question?
It does. So the a couple interesting things. So the current way, there's some hypotheses around why podcast advertising is successful. One is that it's host read. So if aCast, for example, we'll get into how aCast works, but just talking about advertising, if aCast sells an ad deal for my podcast, do I record the ad, or does the ad get? I mean, what's the process there after aCast sells some advertising?
Okay, so we actually separate between sponsorships and ads. So ads are read by the advertiser. So it's like a what do you say, like a spot on TV, basically.
Yes.
Yes, and then we have like sponsorships, which are host read. So we separate the two, basically. So we offer both ways.
Okay. How do you think the podcast advertising model as a whole today compares to the display advertising model? What are the hurdles that display advertising on the internet has overcome? Like, I can think of auctions. For display advertising, we have these massive auctions that take place every time somebody views an ad. There's a bunch of auctions and reselling going on in the background, and that seems so much different than podcast advertising today.
Yeah, it is. And right now, I don't really know if there is any like real-time bidding solution for podcast, but there will be. So we're moving towards that. I'd say that you, as a podcaster, can pretty much just decide that, I want to put this slot up for bidding, basically. So that will happen with real-time stitching of the ad into your podcast, basically. And we're doing that already, but not real-time. We do all the like real-time stitching of ads and the content, basically. So we're moving in that direction, definitely.
Can you talk some about how you do that? So, like, for people who don't know what dynamic ad insertion is for a podcast, is basically, let's say I am a young male who works in the software industry, and I press play on a podcast about sports, for example. Real-time ad insertion might detect that my user agent indicates I'm a male working in the tech industry, and it's going to give me ads for Harry's Shave Club, and because I'm a male and I need to shave, and it's going to give me ads for continuous delivery software because I'm a software engineer, and these things are sold on the fly. They're dynamically inserted on the fly, and then the podcast that I end up listening to has these audio files inserted into the podcast dynamically. So maybe you could touch on how that works on the back end.
Okay, so we have this, we call it the stitcher because it stitches together MP3 files, basically. So what we do is that we take all the signals that we can get about a user, basically. And that boils down to what ad that user should have. And what we do is that we stitch that on the fly, and we store it on a CDN at the same time. So basically, the first person that matches a certain combination of ads, that one is stitched on the fly on a pretty fat machine, and the second user basically gets the CDN version of that. So the incoming requests, it comes a request. Yeah, somebody presses play. We figure out what ads should this person listen to, and then we redirect basically to the CDN. So, and the first one, it falls through the CDN and hits the stitcher basically, where we do all this insertion in real time basically. So that's how it works in really broad, broad strokes.
So if I am a male working in the tech industry and I press play on a podcast, and let's say I'm the first male in the tech industry that has listened to this podcast, so it's not been stitched. I have not had an ad stitched into this podcast. So this makes a request to aCast servers. aCast does the splicing on the fly and sends it to me, and then simultaneously sends it to a CDN.
Yes, exactly. So the second person that is like you will get the CDN version, basically. So on the CDN, I can say for some podcaster, we have like hundreds copies, like different ads combinations, basically.
Do the advertising sales work where like you make a deal with an advertiser where you say, I'm going to sell to this demographic, or do you say I'm going to sell on this specific type of podcast with this demographic? How specific do the sales get?
I think you nail it there pretty much. So it's just we sell on verticals, but also podcasters can like blacklist brands if they like. That they don't want to work with, and we also have where a brand goes in and just want to advertise on a single podcast, and specifically that goes for sponsorships. That's like we're getting the advertiser and the podcaster to meet and greet basically, and they sign like a bigger deal that stretches over months, basically a half year or so. So it's we have a lot of different options there. Basically, we're looking at other possibilities too, where it's like more of a market, like an open market thing. But we'll see when we get there what that's going to look like.
So the mature industries that have made their money from online advertising, they are rife with fraud. And I've been trying to invite people who are familiar with these industries like display advertising or Facebook ads or Google ads to come on the show to talk about it. And basically I can't get anybody to come on because this is, speaking of taboos, oh my God, I don't know if you know anything about this industry, but it's just like, it is so laden with fraud, and maybe it says something about the way that just these markets work. When you set up an electronic market, it just gets laden with fraud. How do you? Do you guys even have to think about that at this point? I know since there's not really liquidity. Since there is a liquidity problem, you're probably looking forward to the days where you have to deal with podcast advertising fraud, because that would at least mean that there's significant enough liquidity. Maybe you can tell me more about that. Do you guys think about fraud at all?
I'd say we don't really have to right now because we're controlling, A to Z basically.
Yeah.
Just to make clear, we don't, stitch any ads on podcasts that are not hosted on our platform. So it's just, any podcast hosted on our platform get stitched ads basically. Just want to make that clear. Basically we control, we do the selling and we have the hosting, we do the stitching, and we also do all the metrics basically. And we also have support for third-party tracking. So third-party, like an advertiser can use their like whatever tool they are interested in using, and we support that basically, so they get the data directly. And we're also launching like a podcast value. Is that what it's called? I don't know.
Podcast value?
Yeah, it's the rules for how you measure a play.
Oh,
so we've.
Oh, sure. Okay, so for people who are totally unfamiliar with this, the standard right now is like, regardless of whether it's a download or a stream, it kind of is the same thing, but it's sort of opaque. Or I'm not exactly sure how it works, but it sounds like you're imposing more standards on what counts as a play. Like if I listen to 30 seconds of a 45-minute podcast, is that a play?
Yeah, that's right. And we've launched that in Sweden. So like Swedish advertisers already use this basically, and we're like the only platform in Sweden that actually adheres to those rules right now. But I think, and maybe those rules will change down the line a little bit, but we're taking the first steps to like standardizing those types of questions, basically, and I think that's really important, for the legacy, to make it so everybody understands what is a play and what is not.
Yeah, and one thing about that is like, there's advantages and disadvantages to having the standard idea of what a play constitutes is. Like, the advantage to having a black box, to having an opaque standard, is that the fraudsters can't know if their fraudulent listens are working or not. If I'm, let's say I start a podcast and I want to raise the rates on my podcast, I want to get better advertising rates, I can set up an EC2 server somewhere and just have it infinitely listening to a bunch of podcasts of my episodes, or making different requests from different IPs and fraudulently listening. And I can do that if I know what the minimum amount of time I have to spend listening to podcasts for it to sound like a listen. Yeah. But if I don't know, then maybe my fraud doesn't work as well. But it sounds like you've come to the conclusion that openness is simply better for the industry as a whole.
Yeah, I think it is. I can't be certain, of course, but I think it is. And the response that we've gotten from advertisers is like 100% positive. So I think it's the right way of doing it. Also, you're also talking a little bit about filtering. It's like, there's a lot of bots as well, and there's a lot of apps that behave like really weird, like pulling down episodes like 2 times or 3 times when you press play and all that. So that's something that we do as well. And it's pretty hairy, all that. But
as is any anti-fraud system.
Yeah.
It gets hairy and complicated quite quickly.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, definitely. And I think Spotify also had this problem like a year back, I think.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, and they've put in a lot of filters for this type of thing as well, for like putting up bots that listen to your music to get better rates, basically. So yeah, that's a constant battle, I think.
I think it is.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about aCast, and I want to have a conversation about aCast and then have a conversation about the podcast industry as a whole. So, we've kind of been touching on aCast in the periphery, but explain what aCast is from the top down.
Yeah, so our mission is pretty much, to make to be the platform for on-demand audio. So we have 3 customers. We have the podcasters that create the content. We have advertisers who advertise and make it easy for podcasters to monetize their content, and then we have the listeners, basically. So we have those 3 legs, and we're trying to be like podcasting A to Z, basically. So we have everything from our create tool, where you upload your content and where you place out ads, and you also place out interactive media, but we can come back to that a little bit later. And then we have this ad insertion technology, basically, and we have an app. for the listeners. And this is where we add something to the medium. Basically, is that when we talk like now, for example, if you were on aCast, you could put up a link to our homepage at this point, basically in time. And
sure. So if I looked at my phone right now and this podcast was playing on aCast, maybe my phone would show from timestamp X to timestamp Y, it would show a link to aCast.
Yes, for example. Yeah. So, and you can also links and images and videos, basically. And we have like a patterned solution for all this. So we're all looking to adding new types of interactive media, and we'll be releasing this fall, basically, which can help us get into new business areas, basically.
So aCast was founded by people who used to work at Spotify. How does the nature of starting with podcasts, how does that lead to a different app and a different experience than starting with music like Spotify did?
Carl Rosander and Måns Ulvestam are actually, they were the two people who actually started. They didn't work for Spotify, but they were like podcast fans, and they saw that this is a medium that needs to be fixed. Basically, it's been out there in the wild and it's starting to grow, and we were really, really lucky to, with the timing, basically. So I was number 4 in, and then Oye, who actually worked at Spotify, he was hired for the sales, for advertising, basically. So your question was how.
Well, you know what? I was curious about how the roots of aCast being in podcasts differs from the roots of Spotify. So, like, Spotify is now doing podcasts, but I think podcasting is such a big medium that I think when you start with music and then you try to ease into podcasts versus starting with podcasts, you end up with a very different product.
Yeah. So I'd say the main difference about podcast and music is that podcast it's really like fan driven. Like you listen to maybe 5 podcasts. I don't know about you, but I listen to like 50 different music artists, basically. And I listen to music like 8 hours a day, basically. And I listen to podcasts like 1 hour, 1.5, 2 hours a day, maybe. So I'd say as a medium, they're like completely different, and they have nothing really in common, except that it's audio. So I'd say that I think Spotify's podcast product is pretty good, but I think we have a lot of more opportunities. We have more flexibility because we don't have to care about music, basically.
Why did you get involved in aCast of all the things you could have chosen to work on?
That's a really good question. It was I knew Måns and Carl from before. We never really worked together, and I was asked to come in to take care of the tech. And I just like them, or like a podcast fan, and I saw like a huge opportunity. And also it's like a lot of investors say, and I agree, that it's not so much the product as it is the team. Mm-hmm. And it was just like, okay, this is a really good team. So every, the founders are like really, really experienced people. It's not like, none of us was below 30, and we had, long track records, all of us. And it's like, okay, this is like a super good team. The timing is perfect. I love podcast. And it's like, yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So as you moved into solving this problem in the early days, in podcasting. So you started aCast 4 years ago? Was it 4 or 5 years ago? 3 years?
2 is it? 2.5? Yeah, 3 years. So
2.5, 3 years ago, you look at podcasting. If I walked into the podcasting industry, I'd be like, holy smokes, this industry is totally broken. There's so many things that need to be fixed. How did you decide where to start?
I think it was, people who do podcasting, to do podcasting better, you need to have it as your job, basically, not as a hobby. So we focused on, the ads part, basically. That was the start. We also thought that, to give the user a little bit more, that is sometimes really hard. You want to have this extra information, the interactive media, basically links to, interesting stuff that they're talking about. So those were the two main focuses when we went into it, and everything else just came along. Basically, we needed to do good advertising, we needed hosting to do this interactive media, we needed an app, and so that's where we started, basically.
Life is too short to have a job that you don't enjoy. If you don't like your job, go to hired.com/SEdaily. Hired makes finding a new job enjoyable, and Hired will connect you with a talent advocate that will walk you through the process of finding a better job. It's like a personal concierge for finding a job. Maybe you want more flexible hours or more money or remote work. Maybe you want to work at Facebook or Uber or Stripe or some of the other top companies that are desperately looking for engineers on Hired. You deserve a job that you enjoy because you're someone who spends their spare time listening to a software engineering podcast. Clearly, you're passionate about software, so it's definitely possible to find a job that you enjoy. Check out hired.com/SEdaily to get a special offer for Software Engineering Daily listeners. A $1,000 signing bonus from Hired when you find that great job that gives you respect and salary that you deserve as a great engineer. I love Hired because it puts more power in the hands of engineers. Go to hired.com/SEdaily to get advantage of that special offer. And thanks to Hired for being a continued long-time sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. So how did those problems, what's interesting about the advertising and the dynamic content is those are complementary problems to be focusing on. If you improve the dynamic content, you give more advertising opportunities. And if you improve the advertising infrastructure, it gives more synergies with that dynamic content. So I think those are interesting places to start. And those also incentivize, as a podcaster, I find aCast exciting because I'm like, well, I spend so much of my time doing ad sales, and it's this horrible ad hoc process of emailing companies, and just I wish there was a company taking care of this. So it makes a lot of sense to me that that's where you start. What are the technical challenges of that? You had to build an app, you had to build a back end, you had to figure out how the ad infrastructure works. Tell me what technical challenges you were focused on in the beginning.
Me personally, I'm more of a front end guy. So I tried to single-handedly do our first app, basically, to get something out there really fast. And every single part has been challenging, and we were really, really naive when we started. It was like, okay, yeah, this shouldn't be that hard. And then when you lift that stone, it's like, oh my god, this is hard. So I think doing an app is incredibly hard. It's just to get it right and get it so right that people actually switch to it is just immensely hard, and we're working every day on that part. To scale the back end has turned out to be really, really hard as well. Even though we're hosted on Azure, so it's in theory we just bump a number and we have another server, but it's not really that simple. And we tried so many different things on the back end as well. And then on sales, culturally, it's like in Sweden is it's pretty well known to be like a really, what do you say, market is willing to change and try new stuff. So when we started in Sweden, it wasn't really that hard to get advertisers to, buy into this and start, buying ads in podcasts. But then it was like, yeah, let's do England and Great Britain. It was like, and nobody wanted to buy ads suddenly. So there was, we had to focus, spend a year to like teach advertisers about podcast, because podcast was really, really like lame and boring in Britain when we started. Now it's much easier and much better. We've done the work and had thousands of meetings to explain the benefits of podcast advertising. So that's been like extremely challenging as well. So I'd say that every part has been challenging. And then like every startup, we've been under we don't have an infinite amount of money. So we've been a really small team trying to solve a really big problem. And I'm really happy. I didn't know at all what I was getting into. It's been so much work to get where we are today. And now we're at a point where it's like, okay, we can breathe normally a little bit.
Well, you mentioned picking Azure. Why did you pick Azure over AWS or Google?
Good question. We have some AWS services running as well, but most of our stuff is on Azure. And it was because Marcus, who is our backend master, and maybe you should have talked to him actually. He's a great guy, and he he's been solving so much stuff for us. And he was he comes.
He should come on this. He should come on the show too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. You should invite him. So he was like a .NET guy. So I think that's why, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, it was really, Microsoft is close to his heart, and he knows that inside out. So it's just really easy to get going. And
is your backend in .NET?
Some parts, yeah. We have a service bus where we send a lot of messages to, and we have C# workers that take care of those messages, basically. Yeah, so some parts are .NET.
Well, let's talk more about the mobile app, since you worked on that. Yeah. I think of the mobile app for podcasting as such an uphill battle, because it almost reminds me of when Windows put Internet Explorer on all of their Windows CDs. That's the equivalent of the iTunes podcast app, or the iPhone podcast app. Like, why would somebody use a different podcast app when the iPhone comes with a podcast app it's not bad? I mean, it's what I use, frankly. I know a lot of people who use Overcast. How do you get people to adopt a new podcasting app?
Yeah, that's I agree. There are so many good podcast apps out there, but I think our, especially with a lot of content that's, like new podcasters that come into our platform, they use the interactive media like extensively. And I had this aha moment just like a year back when my wife said, like, okay, I get it. There was like she was listening to a fashion pod that we have, and they use like interactive media really, really good. And there were links to like clothes and whatnot, and pictures of what they were talking about, and it just made the experience so much better for her. So she got it, basically. And I think for the same thing, we have a really popular. It's not in English, but yet. But I think the 4th season will be translated into English, like a Swedish version of Serial. Called Spår, which use that as well. And when I listen to Serial now, it's like, okay, they should really be on our platform, because that would be, it would just make the experience of this story so much deeper, so much better. To be able to see pictures from Afghanistan, or about this guy who disappears there, and maps and whatnot, and it would be make it just so much better, basically. So, and also we're looking into a lot of social aspects that you don't have in many podcast apps yet, and so
sharing a podcast is not an easy task. Surprisingly,
it's really hard, and we can share moments, which is like we talked about before. It's like, okay, it's really interesting here, like 1 hour into the podcast, so you can share that moment. And we're working on improving all the sharing technology, basically, and we're looking into different social aspects as well that we think will make the whole discovery thing much better. But it's like we're developing every day, and we are gonna get so much better than we are today. I'd say our app is definitely up there with the Overcast and Apple's podcast app. So,
does the app use React Native or any other cross-platform tools, or do you have two separate apps, an iOS and an Android app?
We actually have 3 different apps. We also have a Windows app, Windows Phone app.
Okay. Wow.
and also on Windows it's a universal app, so you can actually use it on your desktop as well. That's just been launched. I think I've been on vacation here, but I think it was launched last week. I saw, but. We have different apps. We had cross-platform and not React Native, but something close to that that we did ourselves, and that was like a budget thing. And now we're really happy with how we're doing it. So we have two teams who work like side by side, or 3 teams side by side.
How do you maintain the feature parity between the different products?
We're not like super picky about that. To have them, on 100% on par. The platforms differ a little bit. So, like Android doesn't have the handover, for example, that iOS has. So, but as they're sitting pretty much in the same room, it's just and we're syncing every week on what we're doing, or the teams are syncing like every hour, I guess. But we have meetings every week, like, okay, what are we working on right now? And also it's a lot about an app is half of the app is like backend, I'd say. So if you develop one backend feature,
sure,
that would, you need to stay on par, basically.
Yeah. Well, and luckily the backend development side is unified, basically, because you use the same API for everybody.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit more about the backend component. So you mentioned social, for example. I think of social as this engine that can potentially really give you a lot of feedback into how you want to do the discovery platform on aCast. You want the podcasts that are aggressively being shared or liked somehow, you want all that information to feed back into aCast. So how do you get that information off of these other platforms? Like, once a podcast has been shared, how do you follow up on how many likes it gets? Can you do that?
No, that's kind of hard to do, actually. And that's because if we talk about like Facebook likes, if somebody shares on their Facebook site, we can't really measure that, and that's like impossible for anyone to share. It's just the people, the one who shared it, who actually can read that value. But what we do is what we know about is when plays happen, when shares happens in our apps, basically. So that that gives us really good hints, and that can be used in like for recommendations or for trending podcasts, basically. In third-party apps like Overcast and so, we can only, like everybody else, we just know, okay, somebody's playing this episode, basically, and we can say something about who's actually pressing play, but so that's something that we're working on, and I think we have some pretty good technology coming out here this fall. And it's all about, as we talked about in the beginning, about discovery and finding new content.
Okay, so I want to talk. We're running close to the end of the time, so I want to talk some about the podcast industry as a whole. What role does Apple play in the podcast industry?
Oh, they're huge, and that's because they own the biggest library, basically, of RSS links. So, and they have the biggest. I think it's the biggest podcast app. It should be. It must be. I don't have any data on that, but so I think they play a pretty big role. I'd love to investigate other ways of building the library. I'm really interested in blockchains and that type of technology. To I don't know, not to bring down Apple, but I think maybe to stay true to what podcast is like this really democratic spread medium. Maybe we could do a better library than the iTunes library, and do that together, like on a blockchain or something like that. But they play a huge role, and it's like, they invented podcast in a way, so, and they will continue to play a big role. But to me, I'm a little bit, it feels like they haven't really moved that much the latest years, and but I would be surprised if there wasn't any movement soon from their side.
Funny. Yeah, I know. I mean, it's funny because they obviously have some slightly bigger cash cows than podcasts.
Yeah.
So there's also...
But there is as we're talking, what we're talking, there is huge opportunities here because it's like an evolving mainstream medium. So I think Apple, will open up their eyes and move soon. I would be surprised if they didn't.
Is there any risk of having diverging standards? Because, for example, you mentioned that your format for, I think you mentioned that the dynamic content or the rich content, if I'm listening to a fashion podcast and I see the dress pop up on my phone, I think you mentioned that that's patented, right?
Yes.
So is there a risk of a divergence in, so if Apple wanted to do something similar, and they want to go around your patent, is there a risk of diverging standards?
Of course there is, but right now it's a patented solution, and the patented solution is really not on the interactive media, but on the ads. But the interactive media is part of it. So, but the focus is on ads. It's there is this risk, but on the same, we would love if we could use the aCast as a standard. Of course, what we come up with, basically, it's not our business model to do the interactive media. Our business model is dynamic ad insertion, and we haven't really touched on that, but we just released aCast Plus, which is like the podcasters can lock down their content, so you as a listener can go in and pay a monthly fee to listen to to get early access and get ad free, and also like special episodes if you are a paying listener, basically.
Interesting.
Yeah. So. But as I said again, diverging standards. There is this risk, and we're putting out there, but our business policy, sell ads and sell, this subscriptions, basically. Yeah.
Do you have any metrics for how fast podcasting is growing?
We usually refer to the Edison. What is it called? Like the Edison Institute? Is that? I think, but I don't have those numbers in my head. I should have.
Oh, okay. No, don't worry about it. No, I'm just wondering because there are some people who say it's growing at this percent, some people say it's growing another percent, and it's hard to get. I mean, it's pretty open.
Yeah, we always refer to the Edison. Is it called the Edison Research something?
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, look it up. I should have that in my head, but I don't, unfortunately. But it's like, I think, I might be totally wrong, but it's like 10% last year, like increase. So yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of technical advances that are leading to some fundamental changes that are making people listen to audio more. I think the main thing is the streaming availability has gotten just really good and really fast. And so it's just easier to listen to a podcast on demand, even if you haven't downloaded it. Yeah. Go ahead.
And I think it's a lot of people, like when they go to work, what is that called? When commuting. Yeah. So, I have two cars, and I have like a 6-year-old car which can't really connect to my phone at all, and then I have a newer car where it's like, I just go into the car and it just starts playing a podcast. So that makes like a huge difference for me personally, and I think it does for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it does for sure. So final question. There's this quote by Joshua Benton that's become somewhat famous in the podcasting industry, where he says, podcasting in 2015, because this quote is from a year ago, podcasting in 2015 feels a lot like blogging in 2004. To what degree do you agree with that quote?
Yeah, I think he's right in the sense that it's like, I don't really 2004. What happened in the blogging? I lost track, but
I have no idea.
Didn't it grow out to be like mainstream by then in 2004? And what I see, though, what I think, the fates of the two are pretty different. We see, or at least from my point of view, blogs are kind of fading out or dying, but I don't think like audio will in the same. I think we will replace radio, basically. That's what I think we will do eventually. So yeah, I agree that we're like, this is the new place to express yourself. It's really easy to get started, and it's somewhat hard to find blogs, and then somewhat hard to find podcasts at this point. But I think, as I said, I don't think we will see a decline in podcasts. Rather the opposite. It's just it's going to replace radio eventually, and that's how people will, they will listen. Like TV is dying, and Netflix and stream services are taking over basically, and I think the same will happen with podcast and radio.
Yeah, and what I think is so interesting is that is podcasting going to be so, like, if I'm walking down the street and I'm wearing an earpiece and an augmented reality pair of glasses or contacts, if I'm listening to audio and I'm seeing images that are associated with the audio, or let's say I'm wearing my augmented reality contact lenses and I'm interacting with my Amazon Alexa, and it's communicating audio to me, and I'm seeing images from my Amazon shopping cart displayed on my augmented reality. Is all of this audio in the purview of podcasts, or are there other audio dimensions or formats? I could definitely see a richer set of formats, but I don't know. It's so hard to predict.
Yeah, it's really, really hard. I really hope and believe that podcast will remain as open as it is today. Because that's its strength, basically.
Yeah.
Anybody can create content, and it's really easy to get going and get it out there. To lock it down, or what do you say? Yeah, I'm just thinking, if there are other ways, it needs to be more locked down than the openness of podcast that we have today, and I hope not. But obviously, like when you get into like the geofenced audio material, when you get close to a shop, there is like a podcast from that shop, for example. Maybe we have to look at different ways of doing it, or maybe we can solve it. I hope so. I'd love to keep it open and keep it, accessible, just like the web is. I really believe that's important.
It's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to imagine a future in which it's not, because it's not this DRM driven, record industry type of situation where it's like the establishment is non-open and there's pressures to become open. It's the origins are open, and
and I think that a lot, most podcast producers like to have it that way. So even if there was like a way to lock it down, and I think they would stick to the openness. And I'm saying that even though we have this lockdown option, but the lockdown option here isn't, it's still available like it was, yesterday. It's just that you get some perks like ad-free, and you're actually not paying, you're paying the podcaster.
YouTube is not the same as Netflix, and that's not the same as Hulu. These are different platforms for watching videos.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Mikael, this has been an illuminating conversation. I have really enjoyed it, and I have gotten a lot of interesting, useful information out of you for my own usage. For the listeners. So thanks for coming on the show. I'm a fan of aCast, and I will be following you and the team at aCast closely. And I want to thank Caitlin for setting up this this interview.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Great talking to you.
Thanks to Symphono for sponsoring Software Engineering Daily. Symphono is a custom engineering shop where senior engineers tackle big tech challenges while learning from each other. Check it out at symphono.com/sedaily. That's symphono.com/sedaily. Thanks again, Symphono.
Wow.